Make yourself comfortable. Together, we are going to create miracles. And I will try to show you that something extraordinary is bound to happen to you today. That there is a good chance I could get killed by my staircase, and that your favorite athletes, when they seem to be in the zone, are just as lucky as they are talented. In short, get ready to travel to the heart of the laws that lie behind the emergence of unlikely events and astonishing coincidences. And that sometimes someone misses their flight and that flight crashes. That two strangers cross paths by chance and discover that they have the same name, were born on the same day, and gave their dog the same name. In 1898, the writer Morgan Robertson published Futility of the Wreck of the Titan, a book in which a gigantic ocean liner, considered unsinkable and named the Titan, hits an iceberg in the North Atlantic, while there aren't enough lifeboats for everyone. 14 years later, the Titanic sinks in conditions strangely similar to those described in the novel. On board is stewardess Violet Jessop, who seems to collect maritime disasters the way others collect stamps. Back in 1911, she was already on board the RMS Olympic when it collided with another ship. It was more of a scare than anything else, just a warm-up, because the following year, she was on board the supposedly unsinkable Titanic when it sank. Once again, Violette survived by getting into a lifeboat. And because two disasters make a solid foundation, but not yet a specialty, Violette boarded the Britannic 4 years later, in 1916, which exploded and sank in the Mediterranean after hitting a mine. And once again she managed to survive. All these very real events seem so unlikely that you're tempted to call it a miracle. But are they really? To try to find out, we need to examine, with a statistical magnifying glass, the law of large numbers, which is an incredible machine for producing miracles. To explore this law, behind which lies a dizzying number of extraordinary events, all you have to do is play a little game. If you take part, I promise that some of you will experience an incredible moment. The game couldn't be simpler. All you have to do is take a coin and flip it 10 times in a row, noting each time which side it lands on. And while I also take part in this game, we're going to start a second one at the same time. Choose, without thinking too much, an integer between 1 and 1000. Go with your instinct, a bit at random, and remember it. Or better yet, pause the video and write it in the comments. Now, what if I say 742? Well, I bet that after a few days of this video being up, there will be about 100 of you raising a questioning eyebrow. And felt a little shiver when you realized we picked the same number. And even several hundred of you were born on January 28th. Exactly the same day as me. Up to this point you might say, nothing surprising. I'm stating the obvious. In this case, there are only 1000 possible choices. And in the other, there are only 365 possibilities, and assuming that at least 100,000 of you will play, the coincidence isn't mysterious, it's just overcrowded. When you invite 100,000 people to choose a chair in a room that only has 1,000, you end up piling on top of each other. On the other hand, what's much stranger is that if all of you took part in the coin toss game, then about 100 of you must have experienced a somewhat ecstatic moment. Because when you flip a coin 10 times in a row, 100,000 times you get on average nearly 200 times where you get 10 heads or tails in a row. Nearly 2,000 times you get 9 heads or tails in a row. And nearly 9,000 times you get 8 heads or tails in a row. Individually, our chances of getting a long streak are minimal as shown by my coin tosses. But we're not alone, there are 100,000 of us. And when 100,000 people give randomness enough chances to play out, they almost always end up by producing events that seem bizarre and outrageous. Now, let's try to take a broader view to convince ourselves that gigantic samples create small miracles. Let's say we consider any event miraculous, no matter its nature, that has, let's say, a 1 in a million chance of happening each day. With such a definition, in our group of 100,000, on average, 3 people will witness a miracle in the coming week. To those 3 I say, I beg you, come back and share with us in the comments the improbable event, the extremely rare accident, or the astonishing coincidence that you witnessed. I'll feature your story in the comments for everyone to see. But where it gets even more disturbing is that, in reality, we don't need to be that many to be sure of witnessing a miracle. Statistically, we are all currently walking toward a highly improbable event. To understand why the emergence of the extraordinary is only a matter of time and timing, we need to look at Littlewood's law, which assumes that roughly a human sees or hears one event per second while awake. No matter what the event is, it could be a fly passing by, a leaf falling, a thought you have, you get the idea. Based on this principle, each of us experiences a little over 1.5 million events per month. Now, if we consider that a miracle is an event that happens at a frequency of 1 in a million, then we can expect to observe on average a little more than one miracle per month. In other words, on an individual level, seemingly miraculous events are actually quite common, and the real surprise wouldn't be that the improbable happens to you, but that it doesn't happen to you. Well, the thing is, even if the improbable is relatively common, many exceptional things that happen to us aren't perceived as such. Because many of these statistical miracles can be hidden in the details or go unnoticed, diluted and drowned in the ocean of ordinary events that surround them. If you receive, for 7 days in a row and at the same time, a text message with exactly the same number of letters, it's not certain that you would even notice. Whereas other more striking events, like getting pooped on by pigeons 3 days in a row in 3 different cities, will stay with you forever. That really happened to me. But I can't figure out if the event is really that exceptional. Anyway, what I wanted to say, before I interrupted myself, is that crowds are machines for producing the improbable over time, and they do it much faster than you might think. The probability of being struck by lightning is 1 in a million per year. In other words, it would take an average of 1 million years for the sky to come crashing down on your own head. Now let's regroup again. In our sample of 100,000 people, 7 to 8 of us will on average be struck by lightning during our lifetime. Maybe some of you have even already been struck. Just as troubling, the probability that none of us will be struck is 0.14%. In other words, with 100,000 of us, there are already enough of us that it's extraordinarily unlikely that nothing extraordinary will happen to us collectively. Now, keep in mind that our sample of 100,000 is relatively small compared to the size of humanity. With 8 billion players at the same time, the consequences of the law of large numbers become absolutely staggering. Because the colossal number of repeated trials ends up turning all tiny probabilities into inevitabilities. So, an event that only has a 1 in a million chance of affecting you personally in a year impacts about 20 people per day on average, on a global scale. And from this constant lottery, with countless attempts, over the long term, events inevitably emerge whose improbability is off the charts. And so, on a quiet afternoon in 1954 while in Alabama, Anne Hodge is taking a nap on her couch, without knowing that life has handed her the wrong winning ticket. A meteorite from the far reaches of the solar system comes crashing through her roof at just the right angle to bounce off her wooden furniture before hitting her. The result? A painful bruise, and the rather dubious honor of being the only person in the 20th century to have been directly struck by an object from space. With no causal link whatsoever, 18 years later, flight attendant Vesna Vulovic survived a fall of more than 10,000 meters without a parachute after the plane she was on exploded in midair. Sometimes, the side effects of living in a vast world that's constantly rolling the dice even give rise to chains of events whose probability seems so astronomically low that it's hard to believe they actually happened. Some people have a knack for dodging trouble. And then there's Roy Sullivan, who was struck by lightning 7 times over 35 years between 1942 and 1977. Each time, Roy loses some hair, his shoes or his hat get burned, his skin is marked, but he always comes out alive. That alone could be seen as a minor miracle. Except that studies show that in 90% of cases people struck by lightning survive. Which means that the probability of surviving such an event 7 times in a row is almost 50%. In fact, what's mind-blowing about this story isn't so much that Roy survived his improbable premium subscription to thunderstorms, but that he was struck 7 times. Because if we take as a basis our 1 in a million chance per year, then the probability that the same person gets struck by lightning 7 times in 35 years is 1 in 150. Billions of billions of billions of billions. A value so absurd that it seems statistically as unlikely as seeing a shark win the lottery at the exact moment a meteorite lands on its head. And there, in the face of such outrageous bad luck, you're tempted to believe in a real miracle. Except that this remarkable statistical persistence stops appearing like a glitch in the matrix, like an extraordinary anomaly of the universe. Once you take into account the fact that Roy was a forest ranger in a region frequently hit by storms, and that he often spent his days outside working under trees when everyone else would take shelter. And that's why chance seems to have relentlessly turned Roy into electricity's favorite meeting point. But perhaps the most interesting thing about all this is our tendency to see the improbable where there isn't any by giving importance to what surprises us. Imagine that a big city sells 10 million subway tickets every day, and each ticket has a 6-digit number. So every day, hundreds of tickets with seemingly special combinations are put into circulation. Some have 6 identical digits, others have sequences, symmetrical patterns, or correspond to a particular date. In short, by giving importance to these numbers when we have them in our hands, even though they are no more likely to come up than any others, we create the illusion that we're dealing with something special, something improbable. So our brain is full of faulty intuitions that tend to give a miraculous quality to coincidences that aren't really miraculous. There are 3 kinds of lies. Lies, damned lies, and statistics. The birthday paradox illustrates this pitfall very well. To the question, how many people are needed in a room for there to be more than a 50% chance that 2 of them share the same birthday? Our intuition tells us, usually around 100 after all, there are 365 days in a year. You'd probably have to fill a good part of the calendar before birthday matches become likely. However, the correct answer is only 23. 23 people are enough to push the odds past 50%. With 50 people, the probability even approaches 97%. The problem here is that our brain tries to compare one person's birthday to the other, 364 days, when in fact, we need to compare each date to all the others. This example shows us that we almost always underestimate the number of possible combinations in reality. When you meet someone who shares your obscure passion for fossil insects and rocks that look like potatoes, your mind often comes to the conclusion that there's something terribly improbable here, and mentally highlights this alignment in red, forgetting the hundreds of other coincidences that would have seemed just as improbable to you. Here, just like in the subway ticket example, we fall victim to selection after the fact, because we don't define in advance which combinations will be considered impressive. So, to get an idea of the probability of such an occurrence, we often intuitively multiply the probabilities together. One chance in 365 that we have the same birthday multiplied by 1 in 2500 that we are both fascinated by chairs that are alone and abandoned in the middle of nowhere. And the final result seems astronomical to us, except that this calculation assumes that only these precise combinations would have impressed us. But the range of possible comparisons was absolutely immense from the very beginning. But just a few matches are enough to spark amazement. And while misleading coincidences flourish, we ignore everything we don't have in common. Along the same lines, there's an example I really like. A few years ago, a researcher had fun calculating the probability that you exist as you are with your genetic makeup by roughly estimating the chances that your ancestors met over hundreds of thousands of generations. And he came up with the staggeringly small number of 1 chance in 10 to the power of 2,640,000. Beyond the simple pleasure of the exercise, this reasoning is completely absurd because you already exist. In terms of logic, it's like throwing a dart randomly at a wall and then drawing the target around the point of impact to marvel at your own accuracy. Which we should be able to tone down by looking at some statistics. Most of us have already experienced this very particular moment. When, as soon as the airplane engine starts to change its tone slightly, you suddenly remember that you're in a pressurized aluminum cylinder flying at 850 kilometers an hour, 10 kilometers above the ground. And our brain then decides, without consulting any statistics, that the end is near. Meanwhile, our imagination keeps producing elaborate cinematic scenarios, featuring tired bolts and rather distracted engineers. What's remarkable in this situation isn't so much that we're afraid, but that we're afraid here specifically and not elsewhere. Because statistically, the drive to the airport is always riskier than the flight itself. But no one clings to their seat screaming, "My God, the country road!" To illustrate how much our brain struggles to assess the probability of something terrible happening to us, let's have some fun and gather 1 million people in a gigantic stadium. You're all there and so am I, and on top of that we have popcorn. Above each seat, there's a light bulb that turns on if someone in the stadium dies from a specific cause. And now, we're going to go through some events, which, like little unruly monsters living in a statistical zoo, could take your life in the coming year. To start, we welcome the legendary and much feared shark attack. And nothing happens. The stadium remains in darkness because the annual probability of being killed by a shark is about 1 in 40 million. So, to hope to see even a single light bulb turn on, you would have to fill hundreds of stadiums completely. The shark isn't a risk, it's our dramatic mascot. Even cattle are statistically more dangerous than sharks. In the United Kingdom alone, an average of 4 people are fatally knocked over or trampled by a cow every year. Now let's move on to the probability of dying in a plane crash. Again, the stadium remains in darkness because it's 1 in tens of millions per flight. And you would need to fill several stadiums to see a single light bulb turn on. With the annual probability of being struck by lightning, a small light bulb lights up in the stadium. Zeus's anger doesn't strike down busloads of fans. When we look at the annual risk of dying in a car accident, nearly 100 seats light up. And when cardiovascular diseases come into play, nearly 2,500 bulbs suddenly light up. Because the probability of dying from them is 1 in 400 per year. In fact, if we stayed in this stadium our whole lives, the weaknesses of our hearts and arteries would eventually light up 1/3 of the entire stadium. And this almost reptilian tendency of our brains to get ridiculously alarmed by anything that flashes, crashes, or has teeth often even makes us panic at the sight of plunging graphs. Munir from the Finari channel can explain it better than I can.
If we consider a stock market crash as a drop of more than 20% over a short period, then there have been 27 crashes since the famous Black Friday of 1929. On average, that's 1 crash every 3 to 4 years. So concretely, the probability of a crash happening this year is low. But the probability that you'll experience at least 1 in your lifetime is actually almost 100%. What the data then shows is that these crashes last on average less than 10 months. The rebound period that follows lasts almost 3 times longer. The most troubling figure is this one. Over the past 20 years, 7 of the 10 best days in the stock market happened within the 2 weeks following the 10 worst days. The rebound happens exactly when everyone has panicked and sold. Missing out on the 10 best days over 20 years cuts your performance in half.
Okay, so the probability of experiencing a stock market crash during our lifetime is almost 100%. And meanwhile, we keep clinging to the airplane seat or scanning the ocean for the movement of a fin. The reason is that our brain has evolved to detect immediate and visible threats. It must be said that reacting quickly to fire or explosions or to suspicious movements in the bushes is much more effective for surviving in the savannah than calmly asking questions when you find yourself facing a lion. What is the probability distribution of this situation? The problem is that today, in our modern societies, this heritage leads us to direct our fears toward what bites, what explodes, or what falls from the sky, with flair, and makes the headlines, while in reality, almost all of the threats around us simply progress quietly. The bed is the most dangerous place in the world. The majority of us will die there. In fact, if we were truly sensible, we should even look at our furniture as a potential killer. Because from a statistical point of view, stairs, like your couch, are stealthy predators infinitely more threatening than the ocean. The annual risk of death from a domestic accident is about 1 in 25,000 per year. Enough to light up 40 bulbs in our stadium. And unlike sharks, your furniture has settled in your home, where it patiently waits for you to wear socks that are a bit too slippery to take you down. The problem is that we now live in a world where, in the vast majority of cases, the risk doesn't jump out at us. Sometimes you don't even notice that it's there and that you're sitting on it. A couch has no malicious intent. It has cushions, yet, statistically, staying slouched on it for too long indirectly turns it into a killer, because a sedentary lifestyle is associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular diseases. If the presence of this daily, widespread risk doesn't set off any inner alarm bells or dramatic music in our heads, it's because these risks are often slow, cumulative, and invisible, since they don't jump out at us from behind bushes. Other brains, which prefer fins and explosions, politely ignore them. And that's why, while seasonal flu lights up dozens of bulbs a year in our stadium, no one makes blockbusters called The Return of the Rhinovirus or Attack of the Poorly Lit Landing. Just to drive the final nail in the coffin of our intuitions, which almost always overestimate spectacular risks, let's add that our brains tolerate risks we choose to take and think we control much more easily than risks imposed on us. Typically, driving your car feels safer to you than taking a plane, even though it's piloted by someone highly competent. Now you can make yourself comfortable again, ideally away from a staircase. We're going to crunch some numbers that show we regularly make mistakes when interpreting randomness. Let's take an annual risk of 0.1%. An event that has neither clause nor any alarming features, and has a 1 in 1,000 chance of happening each year, almost instinctively seems like something we shouldn't worry about. Yet, out of 100 people who live to 88 of them on average will experience it. If the annual risk rises to 1%, then 55% of people will experience it during their lifetime. The difference between 1% in a single year and almost a 1 in 2 chance over a whole lifetime is staggering. And there you have it. A small risk repeated over time turns into a probability that jumps off the charts. Because every year that goes by is a new opportunity for chance to play its part. Another very common mistake that distorts our perception of danger. We often confuse relative risk with absolute risk. If I tell you that drinking this beverage I'm about to have increases my risk of developing a serious disease with a funny name by 50%, that should immediately lead you to the conclusion that I'm suicidal. In our minds, doubling is a radical transformation that sounds like an alarm siren. But if said disease affects 1 in 100,000, then by increasing the risk of developing it by 50%, I'm only raising its probability from 2 cases in 100,000 to 3 cases in 100,000. A one-time increase of a small thing remains a small thing. The relative risk has indeed jumped, but the absolute risk has barely budged, because its initial base is tiny. Often, the media, knowing that our brains interpret numbers with vivid imagination, will prefer headlines like, "Risk doubled rather than an absolute increase of one case in 100,000, and thus, in our minds, turn modest changes into imagined catastrophes." It's precisely to counterbalance our difficulty in grasping all these numbers, which often don't clearly tell us whether we should panic, put things into perspective, or just shrug it off. On a inventé l'unité du danger, the micromort. A micromort corresponds to a 1 in a million chance of being caught by the Grim Reaper as a result of an action. A micromort is therefore a kind of sword of Damocles hanging over each of our heads, and the thread holding it is more likely to break depending on what you do. Driving 400 kilometers by car or 10 kilometers by motorcycle represents about one micromort. A 1 in a million chance that the thread breaks while you're on the flight. Smoking one cigarette is equivalent to one micromort over your entire lifetime. But since these effects are cumulative, if you smoke a pack a day, then after 20 years that's about 100,000 micromorts accumulated. Which is, give or take, about half as dangerous as attempting to climb K2, which will cost you 250,000 micromorts over the course of the expedition. A deep dive or a marathon, that's about 5 micromorts. For a parachute jump, you can count around 10 micromorts. An activity 1,200 times less dangerous than climbing Everest, which itself is dozens of times less dangerous over a few days than being sedentary for your entire life. Zero risk doesn't exist. Living is about taking your chances. And in this ongoing lottery, micromort units help you make more informed choices by turning risk into a kind of budget. From then on, the question becomes, how many micromorts am I willing to risk for a given experience? And here we are again facing our brain. An extraordinarily poorly wired machine for interpreting randomness, but extremely talented at telling itself stories, thanks to its tendency to detect patterns everywhere, patterns that deviate from the average. And so we believe we see constellations in stars scattered without any logic. And even athletes catching fire. In 2011, Ty Lawson made 10 consecutive three-point shots out of 11 attempts. In an NBA league where even the best players shoot around 40%, it's an astonishing performance. With a 40% success rate, the probability of making 10 three-pointers in a row is about 1 in 10,000. And making 9 in a row is about 1 in 4,000. So here we see a little gem, but we forget that oceans of attempts eventually create pearls. Because even if a professional basketball player rarely plays more than 1,500 games in their entire career, there are several hundred of them on the court each season. In October 2018, Klay Thompson had a legendary game, scoring 52 points in 27 minutes, including 14 successful three-point shots out of 24 attempts. Here too, we're all convinced that Klay is on fire. Except that, when you look more closely, the probability for a player with a 40% three-point shooting percentage to make at least 14 out of 24 attempts is about 3%. A player of his caliber taking that many shots should therefore have a performance like this once every 40 games. What's even more troubling is that with such a high volume of shots attempted, hot streaks become just as inevitable as cold streaks. During the 2018-2019 season, James Harden shot 36.8% from three-point range, and he takes a lot of three-pointers. Out of the 78 games he played, he had one crazy night where he made 10 and twice he had complete fiascos. With one game where he missed 16 out of his 17 attempts, and another where he missed 16 out of 18. Here too, one might be tempted to see these as nights when James's talent stayed in the locker room. Except that if you have a 36.8% three-point shooting percentage, you have almost a 2% chance of a game like that on any given night. In short, even though exceptional games are often the ones we remember, when the number of attempts is high enough, luck smiles almost as often as it bares its teeth. This difficulty in accepting that chance, even though it was stable et prévisible à grande échelle, can produce strange patterns that deviate greatly from the average on a small scale, makes it incredibly theatrical. And our brain, which cannot stand a lack of causality, looks for a deeper reason to explain these extraordinary performances that stand out from the rest. And we talk about players touched by grace, when in reality they are like lightning at the far ends of statistical curves. Behind every god disguised as Michael Jordan, there are a colossal number of attempts. In the same way, at the beginning of this video, it took 99,997 people spending a week without witnessing a miracle for 3 of us to become heroes of chance. Accepting that chance can play the role of a silent referee is something powerfully subversive. In our societies, which teach us that success is the direct result of effort, talent, and discipline, we claim to award medals to the best, not to those who have benefited from a combination of skills and favorable circumstances. Of course, top-level athletes are not just lucky amateurs, but recognizing that in certains domaines, travailler avec relentless effort and honing one's talent increases the likelihood of having incredible matches, without guaranteeing success, helps us be less inclined to look down on losers or blindly idolize winners. An example that I find truly striking of the fact that the world isn't necessarily dominated by the best, but sometimes by those who arrived at the right moment, is the success of 50 Shades of Grey. This book, almost unanimously considered to be terribly written, still sold 150 million copies. For many, the reason this fanfiction, originally posted online for free and without a publisher, became so popular is that it happened to benefit from an extremely favorable alignment of circumstances by chance. When the book was released, it was the beginning of the ebook boom. The popularity of the Twilight series was at its peak, and many new readers were becoming passionate about adult stories, which had only marginally entered these new spaces. So word of mouth, fueled by people who think they've discovered a gem, is in full swing and the book goes viral. Major media outlets then start talking about it, and through a snowball effect, the controversy attracts even more readers. If it were released today, 50 Shades of Grey would probably end up forgotten by history, alongside hundreds of similar and equally poorly written stories that came out at the wrong time, in the wrong format, and never found their audience. Understanding that in a world full of attempts, the emergence of something extraordinary is logical doesn't kill the sense of wonder. It invites us to enjoy watching the joyful probabilistic chaos unfold before our eyes, whether we're lucky or unlucky. And it allows us to dial down our panic, to lessen the hypnotic power of alarming headlines, and to stop looking for hidden causes everywhere. The improbable is not an exception to reality or a bug in the system, it is the rule. Deep down, what's crazy is that the world is inherently blurry, and this imprecision is what makes it exceptional. Without it, there would be no more surprises, and our lives would lose an essential part of their appeal. Fortunately, we don't know what tomorrow will bring. Knowing that it might rain doesn't stop us from going out. It just encourages us to take an umbrella. Just in case.